Hey, so good morning, everybody. Really, really good to see you. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all coming in off the back of a really positive week. But whatever that week has been like, really, really glad that you decided to come and spend this morning with us. And if you are new, if you are someone who maybe hasn't been with us for a little while, let me give you a little bit of context for where we're up to in our kind of Sunday content. So we are in the penultimate week of our current series called Traitors, the Meaning Crisis, where we've been exploring over the last month the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. If you're new to exploring the Bible, Ecclesiastes is a book in the Old Testament that is frankly a bit miserable. It's not a jolly book. But we've been looking at the subject of meaning in our world and thinking about some of the wisdom that Ecclesiastes has to offer. And we've been looking at four big ideas from the book of Ecclesiastes, four big things, four big promises that this world makes in terms of bringing us fulfillment, joy, peace, happiness, and meaning. But how those four big promises often fail to deliver. So far in this series, we've taken a look at the temporary and kind of fleeting nature of life that the book Ecclesiastes kind of sits in terms of a framework and theme. But we've looked at these four big ideas of fame and reputation, hedonism and pleasure seeking. Today, we're going to be thinking about pride and ego. And then next week, we're going to look at the subjects of greed and covetousness. As I spoke about in the opening week of the series, and for those who haven't been with us to this point, we decided to link this series on Ecclesiastes with the BBC show Traitors. And the reason for that is that these four areas we're looking at, fame and reputation, hedonism and pleasure seeking, pride and ego, and greed and covetousness, these four areas are so often thought of as just being normal parts of life and culture in 2025. Culturally, we're always seeing these ideas being hidden in plain sight around us, as though they are just normal parts of what it means to live life well. Our modern culture teaches us that being a household name, well thought of by all, and holding a good reputation is essential for fulfillment. It teaches us that purchasing and consuming things that indulge our desire for pleasure is a right rather than a luxury. It tells us that wanting more isn't about being greedy. It's just a healthy drive and determination for success. And it teaches us that we should be incredibly proud of ourselves, constantly thinking highly of ourselves, that we're wonderful just the way we are, and that this line of thinking is just a very normal part of being a healthy adult. And like I say, the reason I want to link this series with the BBC show Traitors is that these traitors in the book of Ecclesiastes, they're just like the traitors in the show. Their job is to hide in plain sight, to get others to place their trust in them, only to be betrayed later. Now, I won't ruin the show for any of you who've been watching but haven't seen the Sunday's finale, or whatever day it was, Thursday, Thursday's finale. Beth and I caught up in a hurry because I told Beth that last Sunday was the finale. So we sat on Saturday night. We stayed up too late for parents of a little one to watch all of them. And then it turned out it wasn't until Thursday. But anyway, that's fine. The subject we're going to look at today is the subject, the traitor that is pride and ego. And in a strange sort of way, it is probably the best example of the four that we've looked at of traitors that hide in plain sight in our modern culture. Our subject for this morning, pride and ego. Constantly through the Bible, we are told, we are warned against pride. But it's sort of become just oddly one of those kind of functionally speaking, just sins that we accept as normal. Just a very normal part of life. Yet this little list that we've looked at through the book of Ecclesiastes, I think pride and ego is probably the most dangerous by far. The great C.S. Lewis wrote in his brilliant book, Mere Christianity, that the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Sharp words, but accurate, I think. Before we kick off today, I want to say this, that though pride is, of course, a really serious issue that most of us, if not all of us, suffer from in one way or another throughout the course of our lives, the point of this talk is not to leave us feeling bad about ourselves, but rather to think about this subject in an open, honest, and hopefully realistic way. That with God's help, We can have a greater awareness of how pride can impact and interact with our daily lives. And rather than just being okay with it, rather than just accepting it as a respectable sin, instead, with God's help, we could look to think about this carefully and desire to become more like Jesus, that humble servant who gave of himself. Before we dive into it more fully and look at the relevant passage from Ecclesiastes, I wanted to start by just reading through some of the different verses about pride in the Bible. There are a ton of them, so this list is by no means exhaustive, but hopefully it will just give us a good kind of outline for the subject. So we're going to rifle through some of these pretty quickly. Proverbs 11:2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 29:23, a man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit gains honor. Proverbs 8:13, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech. James 4:6, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Proverbs 16:5, the Lord detests all the proud of heart, but be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. Psalm 10:4, in his pride the wicked do not seek him. In all his thoughts there is no room for God. Proverbs 18:12, before his downfall a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor. And then 1 Peter 5:5, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now, like I say, believe it or not, that is a relatively short list compared with the amount of times that pride is mentioned in the scriptures. But I think you get the idea. It's pretty bad. It's bleak for pride, right? Pride is not just a bad thing. It is something that God really detests. Something that often leads to our downfall, something that brings us low, causes us pain. It is bad for God, for us, and for others, which is essentially God's problem with all of sin, right? It's bad for God, it's bad for us, and it's bad for others. Pride is also so often the beginning of a painful descent into all kinds of other sin and unrighteousness. Pride, in a sense, is almost like a kind of gateway drug that threatens to get us started down a path lined with self-righteousness, arrogance, self-centeredness, prejudicial thinking, and all kinds of other malicious and malevolent patterns of thought and behavior. It's bad, right? And I think this is why God is so eager to warn us about pride, because in a sense, it is the entry point for so much pain for God, us, and others. I think sometimes in our culture, people think about this word sin and they sort of go, oh, these are just some arbitrary things that God hates for no reason. But that is the heart of sin, that actually God hates it because it's bad for him, it's bad for us, and it's bad for others. Probably worth saying at this point, though, that pride is not always expressed as a negative quality in the Bible. There are exceptions. It can carry a positive connotation as well. The Apostle Paul communicates a positive sense of pride when speaking about a church in 2 Corinthians 7. He says, I have the highest confidence in you. Take great pride in you. You have greatly encouraged me and made me happy despite all our troubles. So there is a sense in which you can use this word in a positive way. That's, of course, true. However, the vast majority of the time, this word is seen in the Bible as being something that we should be warned against. It's a disproportionately lofty view of ourselves that does nothing but harm. So what exactly is it? Well, this is where Ecclesiastes comes in. So we're going to take a look at a very short passage from chapter 8. This is verse 9, and I think it outlines pride really, really well. It says this, all this I saw as I applied my mind to everything done under the sun. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. See that? This, I think, is the essence of pride. There is a time when a man lords it over others to his own hurt. This is where pride becomes problematic, when it is excessively self-focused and self-elevating. This is the kind of pride that most often appears in the Bible. And the inevitable problem is that when you excessively focus on yourself, you don't leave space in your life to care and attribute value to others. If you excessively elevate yourselves above others, you can't help but think of other people as less important because you've elevated yourself above them. There are, of course, some wonderfully academic and kind of poetic ways of thinking about this term. I prefer a slightly less wordy version. I think pride is beautifully described this way. It's simply a heart that cries out, me, me, me. This, in many ways, is the simple yet really devious root of pride. To be, in a sense, just hopelessly myopic. To be self-centered in the extreme, lording it over others because it's all about you. I have a few kind of pet hates. I don't know if you guys have pet hates. This is not things you hate about having a pet. This is things that annoy you about life. They're kind of usually small and arbitrary things. But I have a few pet hates, but quite near the top of my list would be jobs-worthy people. Do we know what I mean by that? Yeah, jobs-worthy people. You give someone a very minimal amount of responsibility and power, and they kind of treat it as though it's everything. Jobs-worthy people would be on my list. I have two in particular jobs-worthy examples. No offense if any of you are these things. But one of them would be car parking attendants. I feel like car parking attendants lend themselves to being jobs-worthy people. And they sort of, sometimes they're very kind of humble about it and say, oh, well, this way, and that's lovely. But other times you get someone who sort of acts as though they're landing a plane. Do you know what I mean? They're sort of like, they're just ushering in a little kind of Skoda or something, and they're kind of this way. Also bouncers, I think. You know, you ever been through that? This is probably less of a thing now, but when I used to go clubbing, it was if you're wearing trainers, you're not coming in. If you're wearing trainers, you're not coming in. I must have heard that so many times. But I would often not want to go clubbing, so I just wear trainers and go, oh, what a shame. Can we go to the pub instead? But yeah, always I would hear that. And I just kind of think to myself, that's something that really grates on me, you know, when you give someone a tiny amount of responsibility and it becomes this great big kind of egotistical boom in their heart and mind. That is an example of pride on a small scale. Pride on a larger scale can be much more devastating. The great Charles Spurgeon once described pride as an all-pervading sin. He says, pride is so natural to fallen man that it springs up in his heart like weeds in a well-watered garden. Its every touch is evil. You may hunt down this fox and think you've destroyed it, and lo, your very exaltation is pride. None have more pride than those who dream they have none. Pride is a sin with 1,000 lives it seems impossible to kill. And in some senses, I wonder if this idea is part of the reason we may think of pride as not being very serious, kind of not being a big deal, just a respectable sin, if you will. Firstly, because it's so common and natural to each and every one of us. But secondly, because it seems so impossible to kill off that we kind of just settle. We kind of just settle and say, well, yeah, it's there. It's there. I love what he says. The biggest danger of pride is that most of us are unaware of its presence in our lives. Pride is complicated, deep-rooted, therefore hard to identify, and in a sense, kind of elusive. It's that sort of sin where if you're struggling with it, you may be the last person to notice. American pastor Francis Chan says this, that it's like having bad breath. If you have bad breath, everyone else is going to know about it before you do, right? But when it comes to sinful pride, it's almost like there are two types. There's public pride and there's secret pride. We talk about public pride, we don't talk about secret pride. And it's easy to get public pride noticed. That person who talks about themselves constantly, They're incapable of talking about anyone or anything else. It's all about them. Or that person that always has to beat our story with their story immediately. The person that has to have the latest stuff constantly. Everything's always about them. Person constantly talking about how much money they've spent on everything. But the secret pride is just as bad and I think really interesting because it's just as common. You know, maybe we'd often think about people who struggle with pride as being very kind of outspoken, those who are loud, brash, big personalities, as being the regularly pride-filled people. And of course, it can be. But actually, it might also be the case that some of the people who are the quietest could also be struggling with pride in a different way. Perhaps they're terrified about what others might think about them if they spoke up or had a controversial opinion or an unpopular viewpoint. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that all quiet people have a secret pride problem. I'm just saying that pride isn't just for the loudmouths. And I know this firsthand because that used to be me, that quiet, secret pride guy. Not that I think I've conquered pride by any stretch of the imagination, but secret pride was a big part of my story growing up. As many of you who've been around a little while will know, I struggled really badly in my early 20s with anxiety. It was awful, wouldn't wish it on a soul. And everybody's journey is different, of course. But for me, one of the really difficult things I had to face as God took me through a process of healing was that for me personally, and again, I'm not saying this is everyone who struggles with anxiety, not at all. Our situations and the reasons underlying them could be totally different. But for me personally, one of the things I had to realize was that pride was an underlying cause of my worrying. Again, I'm not saying it's everyone, but for me, that was certainly true. Because I would be constantly asking myself, what do other people think about me? Did I look good in that situation? How did I come across with that thing I just said? Did what I say make me sound bad? And I would often hide that behind saying, I'm just a conscientious person. That's rubbish. I wasn't a conscientious person. I didn't care how what I said was affecting other people. The truth was, I cared how it made me look. It wasn't conscientiousness, it was pride. I was hopelessly self-centered in my way of living and thinking, constantly worrying about myself. How did I come across to other people? Again, absolutely not saying that is everyone who worries, not by a long chalk, but it certainly was me, a young man wrestling with secret pride. See, in the past, I've always spoken about what I went through as having had a problem with anxiety, and it definitely was. But as I've reflected retrospectively with the benefit of hindsight, one of the things I've realized is that for me, underneath my anxiety, underneath that worrying, was a root of pride that needed to be dealt with. I was obsessing about myself. How would I be received, viewed, thought of? Let me reiterate one final time. I am only talking about myself in respect of my own experiences with anxiety. And if you are in that struggle currently, if this is a live one for you, I am not suggesting at all that this is you. It won't be everyone's experience. There are all kinds of reasons that people may experience issues with anxiety and worry. So please hear me carefully. I'm definitely not saying all quiet or anxious people have a secret pride problem. Instead, what I am saying is that pride can show itself in many different forms. It can look, feel, and sound totally different from person to person. And I think that's part of the struggle in identifying it, because it's very little to do with the outward actions and much more to do with the motivations of your heart. Pride at its root is a self-centeredness. It's about being hopelessly myopic. It's about being someone who rarely makes room in their minds and hearts for others because it's all about me. who I am, what I've got, and what I've achieved. But at the same time, who I'm not, what I haven't got, and what I'm struggling to achieve. The point is that pride isn't just loud, brash, arrogant, and obvious. It can also be hidden behind things that look like humility. It's hard to identify and it's elusive. Many people see pride as being the root of all evil, which I think is a pretty fair conclusion. We can easily trace it all the way back to that origin story in Eden and say that actually pride is not just a bad thing, but I think it might be the first bad thing. I've often heard Adam and Eve's original sin being described as humanity caving in on itself, which seems a pretty good description to me. Pride, in many ways, was the root cause of the created turning its back on the Creator and choosing their own way, thinking life was all about them. What could they have? What could they become? How could they get even more? See, it's not just a bad thing. I think it might be that first bad thing. And humanity caving in on itself was certainly a good description of what I went through with my worrying. Constantly obsessing, what if they don't like me? What if I put myself out there and people laugh? What if I try my best and everybody sees me fail? What if I make a joke and nobody laughs? I now enjoy that every single week. And in the end, I was so caved in and stressed out that it was just easier to withdraw completely. And what's interesting is that the people who knew me best at the time and saw what I was going through, from the outside looking in, they would have probably said that I needed more self-confidence. But the truth was, what I actually needed was more humility. And that's one of the reasons I think pride can be really hard to identify in ourselves, because it's probably less about how you look on the outside and probably more about what's going on in here. And so I think an important key to knowing how much of a problem pride is in our own hearts is to be honest about our view of servanthood. How do we view the service of others? Appropriate today to think about the service of others. And this is only for personal reflection. This is not to share with anybody else, but I wonder if it might be worth asking yourself this question: do you want to serve or do you want to be served? Do we want to serve or do we want to be served? And of course, it's natural that there'll be situations for all of us where we want to be served, but in terms of that overarching view of life, do we want to be served or do we want to serve? And listen, I'd love to stand here and say I'm totally happy with the answer I would give to that question. The truth is I can't stand here and say that, because there are many times where I would want to serve rather than be served. It's an issue for me, of course. It's an issue for us all, but it's an issue for me. Like Spurgeon says, pride is the sin with 1,000 lives. I'm not interested in accusing anybody else of saying, oh, this is a prideful person or that's a prideful person. It's never anybody's job to decide what somebody else might be struggling with. But I am saying that if you, like me, would say that pride is still a part of you in a way that you desire it not to be, then the next obvious question is this one: what can be done? What can be done to change things? And that's what I want to spend the remainder of the time I have talking about. See, the Bible's wisdom and guidance on this, as well as my own personal conviction, is that if pride is the problem, then humility's got to be the solution. As C.S. Lewis famously said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's not having a lower opinion of yourself, it's putting others above you. And it's not about having low confidence or putting yourself down. That's not humility. Instead, it's about lifting others up. How do we lift others up? Pride has weighed us down and brought us low. Then the solution just might be, how can I lift somebody else up? I believe if we can do that, then God will help us God will raise us in the process. If you're like me, you might feel like humility is a virtue in our world that is sorely lacking. You might be drawn to asking the question, why is that exactly? Why is humility so sorely lacking? Why does it seem to constantly be missing? Well, as some of you have heard me say before, I think part of the reason for that is because from the outside looking in, humility can look like humiliation. It can look like you're being taken advantage of. It can look like our adversaries are getting one over on us. It can look like weakness and vulnerability. But that's not a good way to think about humility. Humility is not humiliation. It's actually a show of the most meaningful kind of strength that one could possess. The kind of love and strength that says, I will deny myself for the sake of somebody else. I'll happily be brought low so that somebody else can be lifted up. And listen, weak people don't make decisions like that. Weak people don't make selfless decisions. Humility puts others before ourselves. And that is true strength, true integrity, and true nobility of character. It is godliness. And even better than that, it's a way of imitating the God who loved us enough to humbly endure the cross. People who think that humility is humiliation, they would look at the cross of Christ and they would see a victim. But Jesus is no victim. The cross is not about victimhood, it's about victory. And Jesus has won that victory at the cross. So why is humility so important? Well, partly because it's an antidote to pride, partly because it's a heart posture that God encourages, treasures, and rewards, but also because we're not just called as Christians, if you are one, to be worshippers of Jesus. We're called to be followers of Jesus. And he's the ultimate example of true humility. I also think it's valuable because it helps those who have been humbled by life. It helps those who have been humbled by life to understand when they are at their lowest, when we are at our lowest, we are not too low that God will not reach into our lives and redeem us with his love. Seems fitting on Remembrance Sunday to share these words of Jesus. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. There is no greater exhibition of love than to lay down your life for another. Jesus is true humility, the God who humbled himself to the point of death on a cross for you and for me. He didn't suffer humiliation, he displayed humility. He was not a victim, he was a victor. If after today's message you are feeling, oh man, so full of pride, how could God love me? If you're here exploring faith and you're wondering, Pete, cut through the noise. What's the core of this thing? What's the bottom line here with faith? Who is this Jesus? Where could I run that you wouldn't run after me? How could I fall when you've already taken the fall for me? Canyons wide, oceans deep, can't contain your love for me. Mick and Michelle are going to come and lead us in our final song. As they do that, let me just pray for us. So, Father, thank you so much for each and every person in this room. Father, thank you that they represent a soul that you love, someone that you created, someone that you love, someone that you died for on that cross. Father, that there is no greater love than to lay down our lives for another. And that is precisely what you have done for each one of us, that you laid down your life on that cross. There's nowhere we can go where your love doesn't pursue us. Father, we just pray. Please, would you help us to leave here today with such a strong sense of the fact that we are loved by you, we are pursued by you, we are cared for by you to death and back again on a cross. Please, would you bless us and guide us in this week ahead and pray, Lord, would you bring us all safely back together again next time? Thank you, Lord, that you died for us. In Jesus' name, amen.